Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Aging Without Violence webinar on colonization, oppression, and racism, understanding violence against Indigenous women who are older. I'm joined today, I'm Rochelle Vassal, the Central West / GTA East Regional Consultant with Elder Abuse Ontario. And this webinar is being hosted by Amber Wardell, who is our project coordinator with Aging Without Violence. And our speaker today, Amber Sky, mother researcher of 6 Nations of the Grand River. So just some housekeeping. All attendees will be muted throughout the webinar. This session will be recorded and will be uploaded and posted on the Elder Abuse Ontario website, as well as the Aging Without Violence website. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please type your message in the chat box. We will dedicate 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions and answers, and you can type your questions in the question box. So if you look at your right-hand side, you should have a toolbar or taskbar, and you have several different options. You have a chat pane, you have a question pane, and then you also have a handout pane. If you click on that, you will actually be able to download the PDF copy of the slides if you'd like to follow along, or if you'd like to print the slides and then write your notes on them. So you can download them right from the handout section. We will send you a PDF copy of the slides in an email for all of the people who have registered. At the end of the session, we're going to prompt you to fill out an evaluation form. If you don't have time to fill out the evaluation form right away, then you will receive an email with the link for the evaluation. And the evaluation is very helpful for both Aging Without Violence and Elder Abuse Ontario to really look at the content and look at what we need to do collectively to address violence against older women. So I'm going to pass it over to Amber.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much to Rochelle for assisting as one of the hosts for the webinar today, and Amber for joining us as a presenter. This is actually the first webinar sponsored by the Aging Without Violence project, and that project began in January 2018. The project is funded by the Government of Ontario, and it will continue for several more years. We'll be going until March 2021, and it's aligned with Ontario's action plan for seniors. You can see a photo there of the Aging with Confidence plan. And it's sponsored by the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, so you'll often hear that referred to as OAITH, and is focused on increasing the capacity of Ontario's service providers across sectors. So that includes health sectors, violence against women, social services, legal services, and we want folks to be able to more effectively support older women who've experienced violence. And we want to make sure that those closest to older women, their friends, family members, know how to respond if they have concerns. The project is guided by a diverse and quite passionate intersectoral advisory, and Rochelle is an integral part of the advisory as a representative of Elder Abuse Ontario. And we have representation from a variety of organizations and consultants as well. And Rochelle, if you want to move to the next slide, you can see on the next slide here that if you visit the oaith.ca website, there's an Aging Without Violence section, which we've recently launched on the website. You can see a full list of our advisory members there, as well as resources for the general public and service providers. On the left, you see that an example of our Word to the Wise fact sheets. We released our inaugural issue in September, and they all focus on a different theme related to violence against older women. So far we released one that focused on language related to violence against older women and had some components of trauma throughout the lifespan. We released one that was focused on resources for service providers that are currently available, and we recently released one focused on intersectional approaches. The fact sheets can all be found on the Aging Without Violence section of the AWAITH website, and they're in both French and English. And if you follow us on Twitter or Facebook, you'll see when we have a new issue come out. You also see in the middle there, that's an example of one of the reports that we have up on the website. And that's our gap analysis, which was recently completed, and it's specific to violence against older women in Ontario. We also have an environmental scan. And I really encourage you to take a look at that and the recommendations at the end particularly, and to see if there are any that you might be able to integrate into your work. On the right side, you see a screenshot. That's from one of the presentations from the March 20th and 21st forum, which we held in Toronto, and it was focused on strengthening gender-based responses. So we actually filmed all of the presenters. They were kind enough to release all of their slides to us, and those are all available on the website. Rochelle presented, the screenshot is of Peter Jaffe, and we also had a keynote by Jeanette Corbert-Laval, as well as a wealth of other speakers. And if you enter the Aging Without Violence section of the website as a service provider or as a friend or family member, the sections are catered to what you might be looking for and all of those tools and resources specific to your needs. And Rochelle, just on to the next slide. So in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, on which we work and reside. These territories, ceded and unceded, are home to the many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together as a treaty people. I've also included here a link to the Native Land Map, which is a unique interactive learning tool and an alternative to colonial maps, and it helps to bring awareness to Indigenous history. At this point, I'll hand it back over to Rochelle to speak more about Elder Abuse Ontario.
Thank you, Amber. So Elder Abuse Ontario is a not-for-profit organization, and we are funded directly by the province of Ontario and governed by the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility. While we are funded by the province of Ontario, we do not necessarily reflect the views of the province. Our mission is very simple. It's to create an Ontario where all older adults are free from abuse and neglect and are safe and respected. And we do this by implementing the Ontario Strategy to Combat Elder Abuse, which was put in place in 2002. The strategies consist of 4 major priorities, the first being community coordination and response. We work with over 40 elder abuse networks across the province. Each of those networks are comprised of stakeholders who are working in the health, social services, community, justice, or law enforcement sector, or even older adults who are interested in taking part in the networks to learn more about elder abuse and learn about their call to action in terms of raising awareness and educating service providers about elder abuse. The second pillar is frontline training. We have customized many different modules based on different areas or sectors. So we've done a module for pharmacists, denturists, hearing instrument practitioners, nurses, social workers, PSWs, whatever the sector is, we will customize a module to look at their scope of practice and what they can do in terms of identifying and addressing elder abuse. The third pillar is the public awareness, and we work alongside other provincial and regional partners to develop videos, like public service announcements, modules, as well as every June 15th, we celebrate World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is an internationally celebrated day. We wear purple and we work in partnership with our local networks to put on celebrations to celebrate the wisdom of older adults and their contributions. And the fourth pillar is the research and evidence. And we work alongside post-secondary institutions to validate our tools, as well as to look at different areas of research, such as Right now, we are working with the Sheridan Center for Elder Research to look at the prevalence of senior bullying. So I'm one of 7 regional consultants across the province, and we're not a health service provider, so we are not able to provide any direct case management or investigation, but we do provide consultation to service providers in terms of helping them navigate the system. We heavily support our 40 elder abuse networks or community response networks across the province. And really our role is to, provide that knowledge exchange between the different regions, to work with provincial partners to develop tools and resources, and to support service providers who are working frontline. So we're really, really happy today to have Amber Sky, join us for this webinar. And Amber has presented at a conference that I held on Six Nations at the Gathering Place in the past, and she's just a wealth of knowledge. So Amber is Gena Gehaiga of the Wolf Clan of Six Nations. She has a master's in public health and is a doctoral candidate at the University School of Public Health. Amber is engaged in a number of community-based projects that work towards the harmonization of Indigenous and Western medicine and health practice. Both a researcher and community worker, Amber's research similarly focuses on establishing the linkages between culture-based practices to improve health among the Haudenosaunee and developing health services that integrate the use of Indigenous knowledge and health practices. In her work, she's dedicated to critically analyzing and addressing the role of colonization and trauma on the health of Indigenous communities. And there's a lovely picture there of Amber and her daughter. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Amber.
Thank you. Sego, Sebaguego, Amber Sky, Yungyats. My name is Amber Sky. I'm from Six Nations, and I just want to thank everybody for attending and for the invitation to speak today on colonization and oppression and racism, and really understanding violence against Indigenous women who are older. I'm speaking today from the Six Nations community, my home on Six Nations of the Grand River and the home of the Haudenosaunee people. We've called this home for over 200 years now, but we're comprised of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora peoples. So we're a very large community, and we're actually the largest First Nations community in Canada. So this is where I call home, and this is where I'm speaking from today. I'm a mother and researcher. I have a hard time defining a title for myself. I play many roles in my community, primarily as a mother of 5, but also as an advocate for my community, for my people, and particularly for Indigenous women. I'm a mother, and I have a very vested interest in supporting Indigenous women and our families. I'm a mother actually of 3 daughters, which really demonstrates, the vested interest I have in these topics. I'm also an auntie, a sister, a daughter, a granddaughter, and so this content of the presentation and the topics we'll be exploring together today are very important to not just myself as a researcher, but also as an Indigenous woman and a community member here at Six Nations, and as well as with my work with many other Indigenous communities throughout Canada. So I'm going to speak today, like I said, on colonization, oppression, and racism, and the role of violence against Indigenous women who are older. Some of the objectives of the presentation are really to develop a greater awareness of the root causes of violence against older Indigenous women, and this includes the impacts of colonization and socioeconomic inequalities. Also to raise an awareness and educate service providers about violence in Indigenous communities, the causes of that violence, and especially particularly that against Indigenous women and how we can respond to that. Also to understand what are some of the appropriate responses that empower Indigenous women who are older and who have experienced violence to facilitate and support a healing process. So first off, I want to get started on this topic of cultural safety. And you may be familiar with this topic. It's something that is really been driven more recently with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but really is at the heart of a lot of the work that I have done in my communities to really understand how we can look at that history of colonization to provide health care and health services that respond to the diverse needs of Indigenous communities. So this ideal of cultural safety moves beyond the notions of cultural sensitivity, which you may have heard of. It moves towards understanding that analysis of the power imbalances, institutional discrimination, and history of colonization experienced by Indigenous people. And really what cultural safety aims to do is be an outcome for culturally competent care. So it's about the ability to respond in a way that creates a safe experience for Indigenous people. And so really asking the question, what do we need to do and know to understand Indigenous women and be a competent care provider for older Indigenous women particularly. So really understanding that history of racism, oppression, and how the circumstances have created the need to understand greater Indigenous communities and Indigenous women. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and I'm going to start with a description of the Haudenosaunee creation story, because I want us to be able to understand the Haudenosaunee worldview and the history of Indigenous women in Haudenosaunee society to begin to be able to understand how that history and how colonization has disrupted the Indigenous world. So the Haudenosaunee, sometimes also referred to as Iroquois people, we hold a worldview that derives from a creation story where a pregnant woman initiated the creation of Earth. So in the Haudenosaunee worldview, a woman initiated creation. And this story contains within it our original instructions on how we are to live as a people, socially, politically, economically, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So if we look at the Haudenosaunee worldview, like most Indigenous nations, we have a unique worldview that shapes how we understand the world. This picture describes and tells a story of our creation where Sky Woman fell to earth and was placed on the turtle's back. And with her, she brought dirt and seeds that would foster the growth of Turtle Island. Now, understanding the Haudenosaunee creation story in detail is difficult to do throughout this presentation, but what's important to understand is some central elements of this story that shape how an Indigenous worldview and our subsequent way of life has been shaped by that. And anthropologist Wade Davis, he just talks about stories, and in particularly Indigenous histories and stories, and understanding them not for the value of being that they are facts, but that they tell us about and they give us a glimpse into the world of Indigenous people. So it's not whether we can believe these stories are true, but it's whether what we learn from those stories about ourselves and about our people. That's the significance to those histories. So in the Haudenosaunee worldview, then, women played significant roles, and our creation story tells us much about this. And it speaks to women bringing life, and being as mothers of our nations, being that women initiated that creation of Earth, and the woman in the image that fell from Sky World. It's important to note that she was also pregnant at this time, and when she facilitated and initiated that creation process, she also brought with her a daughter. So she gave birth to another daughter who would later become pregnant as well and give birth to two sons who would go on to create the earth as we know it today. And within that story, which can take days to describe, we really cement the role of Haudenosaunee women. And largely the importance of that being that we are givers of life through our life-producing abilities, and that extends not to just birthing new life in the form of children, but also in the form of what Sky Woman brought with her, which was dirt and seeds, and bringing life to that here on Earth. And because of those roles, those strong roles that Haudenosaunee women have, Wagner describes in her analysis of the Haudenosaunee histories of this mother's rule that Haudenosaunee women held, meaning that we carried the utmost responsibility and authority among the people, and not in the sense of a dominance role, but of a respect role, right? As women being treated and upheld as those carriers of our culture, with the responsibility of defining the social, spiritual, and economic norms of the nation with our children and with our families, within our families. So we were a matrilineal society, and we continue to carry that on today. Our names, our clan, and the social organization of our communities was defined by the women and your lineage through your mother and your grandmother. So because of this, women had that center of the community, and that kinship structures were highly dependent on our women. And they were held in high regard from the time they were born. So we see that, even as babies, the role that young women play in our society as being defined by that creation story, and their responsibilities and their future responsibilities to the people. And there's a whole analysis of that based on our biological and reproductive qualities that I don't really have time to discuss today, but really describes in detail that role. So if we think about the social liberties that are held today by women in our society and how that has evolved over time, if we can think back to historically within Haudenosaunee societies, women very much held those social liberties that we fought for in more contemporary times. So women also had a lot of political power in their ability and their responsibility for choosing and removing our chiefs. So our leadership depended on clan mothers who would select and remove a chief if that was necessary. And she selected a chief who was a good man, and it was noted that responsibility was placed on women as mothers and as sisters and as aunties, because would be responsible for observing those traits and those qualities in our young people from the time of conception, really, from the time of pregnancy in women, and monitoring that, but also that their strong kinship networks within families would provide that support for the selection of those chiefs. So she didn't do that on her own. And this power was extended to issues of war and peace in our times, because if a warrior wanted to go to war, for example, they needed the consent of the women. And likewise, if the women felt that there was something that needed to be addressed, and that's when the men would get up and act. And so women had a lot of power in terms of defining early treaties and negotiations and sale of land as well, for example. And this is noted because at the time, anthropologists and observers had not seen that type of roles of women in society, right? And them being powerful political stewards for our people. So when we talk about gender and the roles of Indigenous women, what we see is that not just among the Haudenosaunee, but among many other Indigenous nations, this concept of gender and roles was based on balance and not equality. So not that we had equal roles, but it was respected that we had very different roles. However, each role was no different, no less important. So Anderson talks about the fire being equated with the male and the water being equated with the female, and that those are both critical to survival and balance, and that was to be respected. So as a metaphor to understand the roles of the male and female in Indigenous societies. And so working together was essential for the maintenance of the community cohesion, as well as the maintenance of creation. So men often did ceremonies and singing to be able to develop the connection that they describe as women being innately carrying as life givers. So a lot of times when we look to images and narratives that exist in society around Indigenous men, we often see, or Indigenous people, we often see Indigenous men, right? We see the role of the warrior or the chief. And we often neglect to understand the role of Indigenous women within those societies. And that's largely because men did play that role at the outer limits of the community that were very defined, however, by the females within that community. And that's largely because they played those roles in order to be able to foster that connection and that responsibility within their gender roles in our societies. So if we look to the impact of some of those gender roles and roles of Indigenous women within our society, we really need to understand the impact of colonization on Indigenous societies. And what we know is that a lot of those historical burdens tend to resonate in the experiences of Indigenous people today. The disrupted social, economic, political, and cultural structures that we'll talk a little bit more about has really led to a disorganization of our traditional kinship and political structures. And that oppression of our Indigenous societal structures actually still persists today, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But really, we also see a devaluing and loss of our traditional and health and wellness modalities, so our ways of maintaining that wellness and supporting each other. We also see a loss of that as well through colonization. So I like to use this breakdown of colonization by scholars Wesley, Slamax, and Samolsky, because they really break it down into a way in which we can understand some of those impacts on today's society for Indigenous people. So they describe phase one as the demographic collapse, and what we're talking about is the sheer loss of our population. So the loss of our people from early diseases that we had no immunity to in North America, as well as the subsequent warfare and just the sheer loss of people. So it's estimated that Indigenous societies lost between 60 to 90% of our populations shortly after contact. And for some communities, we actually see a total loss of population where those communities no longer exist. Phase two being cultural dispossession, some of the social impacts and missionization and assimilation that followed shortly after. And then phase three being that late period of cultural oppression and psychological impact. So we can see ourselves today in understanding some of the psychological impact and especially with the expression of violence in our communities. So we'll talk a little bit more about these phases. So particularly in regard to the damage to Indigenous women, we know that colonization really worked to destroy those previous healthy gender balance that existed within Haudenosaunee societies, for example. Wagner describes a quote, I quote Wagner, where she says, missionization really insisted that the women's proper sphere was in the home and that the men should take up farming. When this was accomplished, the change not only would take away women's economic dependence, leaving them as dependent as a white woman, but it also tore at the very fabric of Native society, which held that women were producers of life, and they were the only appropriate group to bring life from soil. So really what we see is a disconnection from land, a disconnection from our economic capabilities, as well as our political roles within society as governing the land. And then we went on to have traditional governments be replaced and really change. That change really served to disenfranchise women. So in terms of the displacement of Indigenous governance, what that really did was displace our kinship structures. So in 1873, the Indian Act stipulated that elections were to be held every 3 years, unless deposed by the governor for dishonesty, temperament, or immorality. Only those males over the age of 23 were allowed to vote, and the chiefs were granted title and little really in power in terms of bylaw powers within our community. So it was a very paternalistic system. However, what it did was it served to remove our traditional governance structures from their previous roles within communities, and really remove the roles of women as clan mothers within that traditional structure. However, we still continue to maintain our traditional governance and structure with our clan mothers and chiefs to this day. However, what the political governance structure did was remove our ability to make some of those key decisions in terms of the management of our communities. So Six Nations actually resisted the Indian Act until 1924. So a good 50 years, we were able to maintain our traditional governance in place of that elected governance system until the RCMP removed them, along with our traditional wampum belts in 1924. So what we see is that the ability to have our traditional roles in our governance and have control over the lives of our families and our communities was largely stripped from us through the Indian Act. Residential schools later became compulsory under the Indian Act in 1884, and any Indigenous child over the under the age of 16 was required to attend. So these schools, as we may have learned, practice a lot of severe assimilation tactics, including mental, physical, and emotional abuse. But what's important, what we know is that they actually considered the greatest assimilation tool because of the damage that they did to Indigenous societies and cultures, not just through the physical and emotional abuses that were experienced there, but also because of the stripping of our communities from their children, right? So it took the role of women as mothers away from Indigenous women, and as well as the impact that it had on the children. So we see a loss of parenting skills, particularly traditional parenting and raising techniques, and a loss of love and affection that was experienced by those children in the schools because they didn't have the contact and the connection with their communities and their families. And so what we see is that it eroded a lot of the functions of our families. We were away from our families, unable to be shown love and support. And so the parents suffered a loss as well as the children. And then the trauma that was experienced from that. This is just an image of the Mohawk Institute. Some of you may be familiar with the Mohawk Institute, or known as the Mush Hole, located in Brantford, Ontario. It is the residential school that was created for the Six Nations community, and later went on to accept First Nations children from neighboring communities and some northern communities. But what a lot of people don't know is that the school is actually the oldest and continuously run residential school in Canada. So it opened in 1824 and closed its doors in 1970. So a significant amount of damage to our community was inflicted by the school and the experiences of the children who attended the school. And so it actually became known as the Mush Hole for the very poor nutrition that was experienced in that school. But what we can see is that colonial policy and assimilation really served to take control over Indigenous people and their lives, right? So really this loss of control over our children, over our families, over our wellness was taken from us through a lot of those policies, those colonial policies. And then the outcome we see is of this one of cultural oppression and violence. So a lot of internalized oppression. So internalized oppression is really that of we've internalized this ideal of ourselves that has been created by the colonizer, by colonizing forces. And it has led to a lot of lateral violence within our communities. So the fragmentation of families and communities due to the expression of violence leads to a lot of internal conflict, community distress, and expressions of violence towards each other rather than towards the oppressor. So we've adopted a lot of the same ideals and stereotypes of our people, and we tend to inflict that on each other, right? What I tell a lot of my students is we've been exposed to the same narratives that have existed since contact. We've been exposed to those the same way that everyone else has, and to varying extents, we've adopted a lot of those as well. And what that leads to is a violence towards each other. So we can talk about this violence also as stemming from historical trauma. And historical trauma is really the ideal that entire populations of Indigenous people experience a type of post-traumatic stress disorder that's been compounded by recurrent stressors. While it's termed historical trauma, we are talking about trauma that has continued. right? Because a lot of these policies that we discussed, the Indian Act, for example, a lot of the oppressive policies within the Indian Act continue today, right? We're still as Indigenous people in Canada, our legal selves are governed by the Indian Act. And so a lot of these things have actually just become social narratives, even within our own communities, where we've adopted unhealthy ways of coping with the trauma that we've experienced and the stressors that we can continue to experience. We've adopted those and continue to get stuck in this cycle of unhealthy behavior and violence towards each other. And so really this intergenerational expressions of trauma and violence. But really that those are vital to understand within the historical and political context, social and political context that we're describing, right? So some of the symptoms of trauma and expressions of trauma include elevated suicide rates, of which we see to be staggering in some Indigenous communities throughout Canada. High rates of depression, self-destructive behaviors, substance abuse, identification with the pain of our ancestors, a fixation towards trauma, intense fear, disassociation, somatic symptoms that don't have a medical reason, such as anxiety, guilt, anger, chronic grief. But we really see those playing out within our community or within the people that we work with, as a lot of intense anger, fear, pain or shame, and also we might have unhealthy boundaries, in chronic conflict with one another. So this really stems from that internalized depression. So in this lack of control that we've been able to have over our lives, and has led to not being able to see solutions, right? And fixating towards conflict. We may lack basic trust. See manipulative and controlling behaviors, destructive with self and others, as well as chronically tense or lack of motivation to change, right? To be able to see that we have the control over our own selves and our lives and our communities to see a change. And so this violence that we see in our communities has to a large extent been normalized through the power, control, and coercion that has been enforced on Indigenous people. So we know that disempowered people experience more violence, and we see a lot of systemic violence. So if we look to incarceration rates of Indigenous people, we can begin to understand that domestic violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, emotional violence, and like I discussed, the lateral violence, but really stemming from this history of trauma, and not to say that violence did not exist in traditional Indigenous societies, but that what we see is this normalization and this is heightened experiences of violence, not just within our communities, but like I said, within the system that we are forced to live and work within as Indigenous people. So this is just a quote from Scott, and he talks about those who lack power in society being most likely to be victims of violence, and are vulnerable because they lack the means to resist that violence, to escape the dangerous situations and gain protection from society. And those who lack power may in turn lash out at those even less able to resist, and a cycle of violence is created. And so, we can see that within our communities, whereby we've the power to make decisions over The lives of our families, our communities have been largely stripped from us throughout history. Maintaining or regaining that control is where we see ourselves today in terms of Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty for our rights to our health, to our wellness, and to our social well-being. So if we look at gender violence, we see that intergenerational trauma and colonization have placed Indigenous women at a greater risk for both systemic and interpersonal violence. Rates of violence can vary from 3 to 8 times higher than non-Indigenous women in Canada, but we see that rates for Indigenous women can be much higher in communities. And reserve-based samples, where Brown Ridge found that 48% of women on reserve and in rural southern Ontario to be as higher around 80% of women in northwestern Ontario. So we just see these elevated risks, and that Indigenous women are actually 5 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to actually die as a result of that violence. So the risks are greater for Indigenous women, and the outcomes of violence are much more horrific. We also know that violence is largely perpetrated. We have a higher rates of violence that are perpetrated by strangers, right? Where in the general population, we know that violence is largely a result of a lot of interpersonal or people we know. However, for Indigenous women, we see a different pattern of violence. In terms of discussing elders, I think it's important that we discuss that elders in Indigenous societies were also very, very highly regarded. And we usually see them in the role of role models or knowledge holders. They usually are the teachers and transmitters of our culture and our knowledge, our languages, and they have these respected roles as mediators, decision makers, and leaders because of their knowledge that they've gained and they've held throughout a lifetime. And so they're typically responsible for also conducting and maintaining a lot of our traditional practices and our languages and our ceremonies. However, it's important to provide the distinction that not all older people are seen as elders, but all older people are respected for their lifelong learning and knowledge that they've gained through their stage of life and having lived a life of experience. But what we see is that Health Canada actually considers elders to be those over the age of 55, given the shorter life expectancy of Indigenous people. So just understanding that we have a much shorter life expectancy, and that our elders we often see our elders at a younger age taking on those roles, because we don't have we end up losing a lot of our elders. But in terms of what an elder carries and the role of elder abuse, we see that there's a lot of gendered violence, and this overall loss of roles and responsibilities within our societies has led to Indigenous older women carrying a lifetime of trauma and abuse. So factors such as overall poor health status, a loss of traditional roles and respect in the immediate and extended family structures, this lack of community elder-specific health and social services. We see that elders may experience and be more susceptible to becoming victims of elder abuse. And so while we don't have a lot of data, we know that because of the circumstances of our communities and this history of violence and trauma experienced by our people, there's greater risks. Aboriginal elders are also nearly 2 times more likely to be living with extended family members compared to mainstream population, and which tends to put them at risk for elder abuse as well. So like I said, well, we know that there is very little data. We know that over half of Aboriginal female elders had been or have been victims of violence of more than one type of abuse. And so it's noted that the cause of these is associated with alcohol abuse, power and control, intergenerational violence within family and community, low self-esteem on the part of the perpetrator, and an ability to cope with the stress and loss of traditional roles and values. I also think it's really important to talk about spiritual abuse because as we'll go on, I'll talk about the significance of Indigenous identity to this healing process for Indigenous women and older women. But spiritual abuse is really defined as a mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment as a result of weakening, demeaning, or decreasing the person's spiritual empowerment. And so, we see isolation from the spiritual community, denying access to religious activities, and a manipulation of religious messages. So if we look to our history of assimilation and oppression, there is actually was a time in Canada's history where there was an outlawing of Indigenous spiritual activities. So any type of ceremony was outlawed in this country, and we see the impacts of that in our communities today. And only more recently are we beginning to regain the ability to openly and freely practice our spirituality. But that abuse strips victims of that supportive community and negates the positive spiritual messages that were intended to support our people, particularly in those times of crisis or in those times of need, and act as a life raft in such times of our history. Often we see that was taken from Indigenous people. And we also see that today racism in the health and social systems is pervasive. And we see that both on a systemic and interpersonal levels. And in the systemic, we see a lot of social exclusion and isolation, which limits or prevents political or social and economic participation or access to and participation in other social systems such as education and health. And so these unfair policies and restrictions often limit the full participation of Indigenous people in society. Racism, however, in the system commonly is shown in the form of erroneous assumptions based on negative stereotypes. And so we see things such as alcoholism, laziness, or lack of education as common stereotypes that, really end up within the healthcare system and neglecting the rights to health and wellness that Indigenous people have. They can result in poor care, poor outcomes, poor health. But what we see, is they're often less they're less invasive than we might think. So things like longer wait times, and we often hear of cases of Indigenous patients who often fall victim to the system and the racism within the system by their inability to access emergency care services. There's a number of cases of Indigenous people suffering with diabetes, but being misinterpreted as alcohol use and drug use, and their immediate needs being neglected. And so what we can see is this is a form of violence within the system, right? It's a form of systemic violence where one group of people is targeted based on their background. So if we look to cultural identity as really being essential to promoting health and well-being. As a researcher, as a community member, I see cultural identity as critical to the promotion of Indigenous health and wellness and healing in the current climate. So we know that actually deculturization has been associated with poor health, whereas acculturation has been linked to good health and research. And we also know that this chronic disconnection is really seen as a primary source of human suffering that results in a lot of paralyzing psychological isolation and impaired relational functioning. And if we think back to our Haudenosaunee worldview, we really, the foundation of that is those relationships and those kinship structures, and this disconnection from our ability to live in our traditional ways has resulted in this disconnection. So one way to really tackle that is this encouragement or this support of interpersonal and social relationships. So supporting healthy relationships with ourselves, with our family, with our community, as also with all of creation is important to Indigenous health and wellness. So really connecting is seen as key. And so that's through social relationships. And a lot of our traditional cultural life ways supported that connecting, that importance of getting together, socializing, dancing, talking, those very simple ways of connecting are important to Indigenous people, particularly older people in their retirement ages and stages of life, because this is the time where they often call themselves the talking heads, because of the knowledge that they've gained throughout a lifetime, that people within our communities go to them to listen, to learn, to connect, to develop and transmit that traditional knowledge. And so a lot of mainstream approaches to addressing abuse and health overall within our communities often fall short within Indigenous populations because they neglect the historical and cultural roots of that violence and abuse. So, we're attempting to create solutions that to problems that we don't fully understand. So often, like I said, violence is systemic and paternalistic and gendered within our society, and we really need to address it on both the interpersonal as well as the system levels. And so support for many Indigenous peoples requires that healing, that healing of a lot of the traumas that we discussed in that historical oppression and experiences of colonization. Traditional healing offers a way of connecting and rebuilding those social structures, those political structures, and being able to connect with each other on that relational level. So, like I said, that connection, things like healing circles, restorative justice, counseling, family and ongoing support, and culturally specific activities are examples of really important ways to facilitate that traditional healing. And for women especially, this requires that recognition of their roles and responsibilities, including that connections to land, family, and spirituality. So restoring those traditional life ways are important to that healing process. This is a conceptual model that I adapted from Walters and Simone, and what it does is it gives us a visual representation of those pathways. And so if we think about colonization and trauma, that historical trauma and discrimination, those traumatic life events, residential school, the abuses, and then health outcomes, what we see is that cultural identity and Indigenous healing methods act as cultural buffers. So things like connection with identity, ceremony, traditional health practices, language, and community in the form of kinship structures and family, for example, act as a cultural buffer. So not to say that we have this direct causal relationship, but that we see that it can help to mitigate some of the impacts of those historical impacts on our communities and improve the outcomes for things like our health, our mental health, education, alcohol and substance use, and violence in our communities, for example. So some of those cultural foundations that we can support include Indigenous knowledge, the reclaiming of Indigenous knowledge and transmission of Indigenous knowledge within our communities, those ceremonies and medicines and understanding them as important to not just the spiritual health, but also the physical and mental and emotional health of Indigenous people. Things like our songs and our dances, our languages, the social support networks, like our families, those relationships, those kinship structures of the clan, the traditional roles and responsibilities of our men and our women within our communities, as well as our children and our elders as well. And then that connection with the land and the water and our natural environment. And what those really do is serve to instill this sense of pride and self-esteem and at the heart, like I said, that connection. And so what we see is that we need to recognize how really common trauma is. So this ideal of a universal response when working with Indigenous women really means that just understanding the likelihood of historical trauma and current stressors is great. So we need to assume that they really may have this history and act accordingly with compassion and empathy. So this means creating relationships and taking the time, which is really highly valued to Indigenous people. When people take the time out of their day to create those meaningful relationships and that understanding. Explain why we're asking sensitive questions, be flexible and responsive with your approach. So, I see that we tend to fall into, a best practice mentality, but within Indigenous communities, we need to re-examine that and think about what is the best practice for this community or for the people I'm working with, because a lot of times those responses, like I said, have not been developed to respond to the needs of Indigenous people. And to be open and compassionate with that care coming from a trauma-informed lens. So some more strategies include education, raising our awareness and our understanding of that history of colonization, being critically reflexive in our practice, so acknowledging the power imbalances that exist within the structures we work within and how that impacts the population we're working with. Really looking towards systems change to address those systems barriers. And I think a lot of times as maybe frontline workers, we don't see our role in that systems change, but really being able to work towards that in our practice and advocate for that. Developing trust, like I said, that relationship building, respect and listening, developing a shared understanding of our problems, and not being dismissive of an alternative worldview. And like I talked about, and I started out the presentation with an understanding of the Haudenosaunee worldview, really understanding that a dismissal of that or that history or that need for Indigenous healing methods or modalities or structures within families, for example, is a form of cultural violence and oppression, is one of those current stressors that I talked about that continues this cycle of oppression within Indigenous communities. And then cultural resources, being able to draw on local Indigenous communities and helpers. So what's important to note that not all Indigenous communities or people will respond to the same methods. Not all Indigenous communities smudge or have healing circles, but getting to know the population you're working with, the diversity that exists within Indigenous communities throughout Canada, throughout Ontario is vast. So just being aware of those, that diversity and responding appropriately. And so that's all for my presentation. My contact information is there, and I think we're going to be going into questions. But now for listening, and I hope that some of the information was helpful to the work that you do with Indigenous people and older women in Ontario. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amber, for your insight and, just sort of reminding all of us about intersectionality and the diversity within the community. A lot of us are, who are of, non-Indigenous ancestry, want to work as allies and want to be supportive in the community, but we don't want to, as you were talking about, systemic abuse, right, and being oppressive. So how do we do it in a way that's, compassionate and understanding? So I really like how you laid the foundation for us. Just going to go through a couple more slides here. This is your references. Just a reminder to everyone, the slides are in the handout section, okay? A reminder to the attendees that anyone can call the Senior Safety Line. It's a partnership that we have with the Assaulted Women's Helpline. Phone line is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in 150 languages. And they're trained counselors who are answering the calls, who support community members, family members, older adults in the community around safety planning and warm transfers to direct service providers within their region. We are on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. We have some PSAs on YouTube. But if you want more information in terms of conferences, for example, we have our GTA conference coming up on November the 20th at the Bernard Battelle Center, and the focus will be on acquired brain injury, traumatic brain injury, and how to look at specific strategies to support older adults at risk. So we partnered with the GTA Networks and the Ontario Brain Injury Association. So if you want more information about that, please connect with us and we can get the details to you. Before we get to the questions, I just want to let you know that we've developed a new legal brochure in partnership with the Advocacy Center for the Elderly called Elder Abuse and Knowing Your Legal Rights. We'll be hosting a series of webinars specifically on legal options for older adults who are experiencing abuse. And there's also a subscription list here for Aging Without Violence.
Yeah, so if you go to the oath.ca website, it's down at the bottom of all of the Aging Without Violence pages. It has the actual sign up for the mailing list. These slides will be translated to French, so we'll have those available on the website likely in the next few weeks. So if you follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on the mailing list, you can make sure to see all of those resources as they come out.
Great. And then there's my contact. And actually, I'll take you to the site because I had it up and open. So this is the Aging Without Violence website. And as you mentioned, Amber, 3 different options, right? For older women who need support, professionals, or family members and friends.
Yeah, so all of those resources like today, you know, we'll soon see those slides. You know, what's the slides from today, once those are up, they'll be in the section that's for professionals, as well as the French version. Any recordings that we have available of webinars or any trainings are typically in the section that's for professionals, but you can also see there's some great lists there of the resources that are available for older women as well.
Fantastic. And there are also other resources, like in the reference list that Amber Sky had mentioned. And then there's also the Ontario Native Women's Association that has a variety of different programs, Aboriginal Victim and Family Liaison Program, Circles of Care programs, operating in different areas of the province, as well as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Family Support, which is offered provincially. So there's lots and lots of different resources. And you can also go to the Elder Abuse Ontario website, and that's where you subscribe to the newsletter. And as Amber mentioned, we'll have the handouts translated. And once we have that translated, we will post the video along with the PDF copy of the English and the French. So now I'm going to turn it over to questions. The other thing I want to let you know is that we do offer training as well. We do have the React Ontario Addendum and the Elder Abuse Learning modules. So if you subscribe to the newsletter, you would get the newsletters, conferences, updates, things like that. There's a comment here, great webinar. Do you have any ideas on how to invite individuals from the Indigenous community to join an advisory committee to discuss Indigenous senior safety in long-term care, or to speak about their experiences for the sake of future policy recommendations? And this is coming from the Family Councils of Ontario.
Yeah, so we do have a seniors group here, for example, at Six Nations, and what I've kind of been recommending to groups who are looking to get that outreach to Indigenous communities and get that voice within the work that they're doing, that I know is very well intentioned, is a struggle that we have within our communities about all of the need for representation, right? Particularly with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and calls to action, we're seeing, you know, a great need that our communities have. And so what I suggest to a lot of organizations who are looking for that representation is to reach out to Indigenous communities and see where you can get in on their meetings and their advisories that are happening. So Six Nations does have, you know, a seniors group, and they hold a number of events and meetings, and trying to get in on those boards and those meetings to, you know, gain that insight, so that we're not always looking for Indigenous people to, you know, join those groups, because it becomes difficult. And I think it's a better approach, because you're also getting that, you know, connecting with community, connecting with a large number of, you know, Indigenous people through that process.
Thanks, Amber. That's some great suggestions there. I'm going to encourage people, if you have questions, please do type it in the chat box. I'm going to go through the attendee list, because I noticed that some people are joining us via the phone, and everyone is muted. So if you are joining us by the phone, just raise your hand and I can unmute you if you have a specific question. Just taking a look here. Oh, here we go. So there's another question here. Are any of the 150 languages of those manning the senior safety line those used by Indigenous peoples? Do any Indigenous peoples access the senior safety line or any other elder abuse resources? Just curious. I know our organization has trouble getting any other language representation other than English. Would we refer to such resources, or should we refer to local Native? Sorry, I just got cut off there. Or would we refer to such resources, or should we refer to local Native group first / instead? So the Assaulted Women's Helpline manages the senior safety line, and there are some Indigenous languages that are spoken, and they typically use interpreters through a provincial organization, but I don't know off the top of my head all of the specific languages. One of the things that I would suggest is, yes, I would connect with your local Indigenous community to see what resources they have there. So at Elder Abuse Ontario, we've partnered with different communities. So Amber's from Six Nations. Amber was instrumental in speaking at our conference earlier this year, but I've also been working closely with Stephanie Hill, who is managing a seniors journey project at Six Nations, and she puts on educational sessions for older adults once a month. So we've talked about elder abuse, we've talked about bullying, and then throughout Six Nations, they've received a grant to provide some training for service providers and community members on the It's Not Right program. So I've done a couple of It's Not Right Train the Trainers, and you know, It's Not Right Train the Trainer sessions, and we've worked with Ganakwasha, which provides support for women who are experiencing violence. So I don't know, Amber, if you have anything else. Both Ambers, they're both named Amber, whichever Amber.
I definitely want to put their Talk for Healing. So Talk for Healing is a great resource where that's a helpline. It's confidential. It's all across Ontario, and it's available in 13 Indigenous languages. It's focused on Indigenous women who are, I believe, over 16. So you could call and try to connect with them about a specific resource, or you could pass along that number to call, and it would be a culturally grounded resource for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Six Nations had, like Rochelle mentioned, has a number of resources here in the community to support elders, and really just a wealth of resources at our disposal here at Six Nations. So reaching out to community and community, creating those community connections, I think is important for any Indigenous client you might be working with.
Absolutely. And depending on where some of the people are coming from on the webinar, you might want to check with your local regional consultant, because I know the other consultants are also connected to different communities. Just checking here to see if there's any other questions. That person said thank you. That's amazing. Thank you for the answers. I'm going to just unmute some people that are on the phone, because I don't know. I don't know if you're connected. So let's see. I'm sending some people the audio pin if they want to unmute themselves. I'm going to go to Helen. Helen, do you have any questions?
Helen Harris?
Yes.
No, I found the presentation wonderful and informative, and certainly am doing a lot of thinking about how our organization, a hospital, can respond to the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and just understand more, I think, is the beginning, and then what steps do we take?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Thanks, Helen. I'm going to go to Janice. Janice R. I'm unmuting you. Did you have any questions?
I know I don't have any questions, but I also thought the presentation was extremely informative and very interesting.
Thank you, Janice. I'm just going to send this person the audio pin, and I'm going to go to Lillian W. Lillian, do you have any questions or comments?
No, I think so. This was a very excellent presentation, and I'm looking forward to reviewing it again once it's available.
Absolutely. And just for those of you that are on the computer, if you go to the handouts section, just click on handouts, and then you'll be able to download the PDF copy of the English slides. I'm going to go to Mary E. Mary, did you have any questions or comments?
No, I don't right now. I just want to say, though, that Amber, that was absolutely a fantastic presentation. And I'm certainly going to be sharing it with others, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And I think that's the key, right, is to share this information with your group, your organization, your members. I'm going to go to Pam, Pamela M. I'm going to send you the audio pin. And then I'm going to go to Paul. Paul B, did you have any questions?
No, I don't, but it was an excellent presentation.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay. Shannon, I've sent you the audio pin just in case you're not on the computer. And Tori M, did you have any questions? Okay, well, I've sent you the audio pin if you do. So this is another question here. Hello, thank you very much for this tremendously helpful and important presentation. I am not a service provider. I am a faculty member at the University of Toronto. I wonder if Amber can recommend any introductory level resources on the topic that I might share with my students and colleagues. I appreciate there's a lengthy reference list at the end of the presentation, but I am looking for something appropriate for an undergraduate audience.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple good references in there that are comprehensive. A good document that I like to start with is the one, it's actually done by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. And it's very comprehensive in terms of understanding historical trauma, violence in Indigenous communities, and really lays the groundwork for a number of those historical influences. So I think that in terms of starting there is important. So it's the one by Wesley Islamax and Samolsky. That's an excellent resource as an introductory, and as well as the one by Brown and Fisk on First Nations women and encounters in mainstream healthcare services and systems. And as well, there's a resource by Kim Anderson. She's at the University of Guelph, and she has a number of resources, but the resource that's referenced is A Recognition of Being, Reconstructing Native Womanhood. And she talks on Indigenous women and violence against Indigenous women. So I think that as a starting point, those are excellent resources. Like I did note in the article, there are not a lot of resources or research. It's definitely a gap on violence against older Indigenous women. But if you're looking to get some introductory stuff, those are excellent. And if you're looking for more resources, you can always email me as well.
Fantastic. Okay, and that person said thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions.
And I'm just going to throw out a plug for the OAIF training portal that if you go on to oaif.ca, you'll see in the training portal, there's a variety of topics. So you could do, and all those trainings are free. You could do an online training that's specific about violence against Indigenous women, where we partnered with different organizations to create that content, or introductory to gender-based violence and things like that, kind of depending on, you know, who the audience is and what their frame of reference already is. That there's just quite a number of different topics in there. And then on the Aging Without Violence page, we've kind of highlighted the ones that specifically relate to older women, but there are kind of a variety of topics.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions here, and I've sent everybody an that's via phone and audio pin. So I think that we'll go ahead and close. And again, I'd just like to thank Amber Sky for your presentation and for working with Elder Abuse Ontario and Aging Without Violence and supporting us in being able to get you know, transfer that knowledge to people in the community. I'd like to thank Aging Without Violence, because they are the ones that hosted this webinar. And this project is being funded, as Amber mentioned, by the province of Ontario, and it's being sponsored by OAIF, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transitional Houses. So thank you to both Ambers, and I'm going to close the webinar. And just a reminder, I will send you the PDF copy of the slides to all of the people that registered. And in a couple of weeks, we should be able to post the recording as well as the English and French PDF copies to both the Aging Without Violence website as well as the Elder Abuse Ontario website. Amber or Amber S, Amber W, do either of you have anything else to add?
I'm going to add that folks, in addition to the evaluation, like if they just have general feedback of things they'd like to see, a future webinar, future training through Aging Without Violence, like that entire scope of violence against older women, then to please, you know, you could let Rochelle know because she's on the advisory, or let me know at amber@oaif.ca, and we really, you know, look to your expertise to guide the next 3 years.
Absolutely, and I think there was this, I just got this brief email to me today. So this, you know, there's lots and lots of different resources out there. This is domestic violence risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning with Indigenous populations. So they send out these articles, pretty much get them quarterly. So there's lots and lots of different tools and resources that we can direct you to. So thank you to everyone today for joining the webinar. And thank you to Amber Wardell and to Amber Sky. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Yeah, thanks, Amber and Amber.
Thanks, Rochelle.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.